I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as President Trump's deadline fast approaches, we discuss renewed bombardments in Kharkiv and elsewhere, before looking at the media landscape in the United States and considering the vital role of international volunteers in the war effort.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 5th of August, 3 years and 164 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, and, in Ukraine, journalist and narrative podcast producer, Adelie Pojzman-Pontay. First, though, over to Dom for the latest military updates.
So let's start inside Ukraine. Last 24 hours, 46 drones and one Iskander-M ballistic missile fired by Russia, 17 drones, and that missile did get through. Killed 10, injured 17 to date. Now, we do this occasionally, but just to zoom in on one area in particular to paint the picture, Kharkiv Governor Oleh Sybanov took us to the town of Lazova yesterday in the far south of the oblast. That was just one of 6 towns hit in Kharkiv region last night. This town is roughly circular, about a 1 kilometre radius, got a little park in the south, train station in the middle, pretty normal, pretty much like any small town in Europe. Last night it was hit by 33 drones between 2:45 in the morning and 4:40 a.m. caused deaths and injuries there. The train station seems, along with nearby houses, to have borne the brunt of that attack. So you've got to ask why. I mean, imagine having your nights and your kids' nights messed up like that week after week after week. That's what this Russia is. That's just a typical town, typical small town in Ukraine, minding its own business. Elsewhere, not a lot of movement on the front line. What there was in the Donbass. No movement at all, as far as I can tell, around Pokrovsk. But Konstantinivka, just a bit to the northeast, that seems to be getting a bit of attention. Russia trying to envelop that as they are trying to envelop Pokrovsk. But they seem to be, as we've described it, the kind of giant Jenga model. They're looking for areas of weakness, basically gaps in the drone wall. If they can get people through, mainly on motorbikes these days, if they can get into another position without being hit by drones, they're able to nibble forward like that. When the lines shift, particularly in the Donbass, it's not hand-to-hand fighting or anything like that. They've been able to get through the drone wall, and that seems to be the way they are progressing. So not a lot of other movement. However, let's go to the north of the country in Sumy Oblast, or northeast-ish. Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, the HUR Special Forces, they say they fought off a Russian attempt to advance in Sumy Oblast. They say they destroyed more than 8 Russian companies during the battle. They put out a statement this morning. Now, a company in a sort of infantry setting is about 100 people, really. But they say in their statement, total Russian losses, at least 334 killed, more than 550 wounded. They put out a video said to be accompanying that engagement, which obviously we can't verify, but you will see that on social media. Now then, a little to the east of Sumy, and President Zelensky said yesterday that Russian forces fighting near the town of Vovchansk in that Russian lodgement north of Kharkiv city include foreign mercenaries from China, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan and several African countries. He was citing reports from Ukrainian soldiers fighting in the area that he had been visiting. This is reporting from the Kyiv Independent, said that President Zelensky had been visiting the 57th Separate Motorised Infantry Brigade operating in the area. Vovchansk, you'll remember, that's that bit north of Kharkiv city. There's not a lot of Ukraine north of Kharkiv city. It's about 30 k's to the border. But Russian forces came over the border from Belgorod Oblast in May 2024, and they took a chunk of land and not really gone anywhere since then. They've not advanced, but neither has Ukraine been able to shove them out. Anyway, President Zelensky said yesterday the soldiers on this front are recording the participation of mercenaries from China, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, as I said, and African countries. We will respond. Now, that comment didn't go down well at all with Pakistani authorities, who called the claims baseless and unfounded. And this morning, the Pakistan Foreign Ministry said to date, Pakistan has not been formally approached by the Ukrainian authorities, nor has any verifiable evidence been presented to substantiate such claims. The government of Pakistan shall take up this matter with the Ukrainian authorities and seek clarification in this regard. Now, of the others, China, in the recent past, has also denied similar claims. You may remember President Zelensky said in April that several hundred Chinese nationals were taking part in the war on Russia's side. There were reports at the time that one detainee had paid a middleman 300,000 rubles, about $3,500 to enlist in the Russian army in exchange for Russian citizenship. Now, that same month, an investigation by Russian independent outlet Important Stories identified more than 1,500 foreign fighters, they said, from 48 countries who had joined Russia's army. Now, a couple more for me. Yesterday, Dutch Defence Minister Ruben Brekelmans announced the latest military aid package from the Netherlands. This amounts to €500 million, about $580 million. Writing on X, he said Ukraine needs more air defence and ammunition now. As the first NATO ally, the Netherlands will deliver a €500 million package of US weapon systems, including Patriot parts and missiles. This helps Ukraine to defend itself and the rest of Europe against Russian aggression. Now, that first NATO ally comment refers, I think, to the NATO summit in June. President Zelensky did say that this announcement today is one of the first practical outcomes of that summit in The Hague, and obviously also follows Trump's language about allowing allies to buy equipment from the US. President Zelensky said today, "I'm sincerely grateful to the Netherlands for their substantial contribution to strengthening Ukraine's air shield, the first such step among NATO countries." Now, it comes after Friday's announcement by Germany that it would send 2 additional Patriot launchers, as they said, in the coming days, with more components expected to arrive within the next 2 to 3 months, they said. So I'm just wondering if this comment, the first NATO ally, that's directed from the Netherlands more to Germany as Ukraine. It is a bit of an odd comment, but anyway. It's good that the stuff's going. Now, just finally for me, a story in the Hindustan Times to look at. It says Ukraine has formally raised with the Indian government and the European Union the issue of electronic components made or assembled by firms in India being found on Iranian-designed drones used by Russia. A hat tip here to Ukrainian blogger Military News UA for spotting this one. It was on social media. Now, the article in the Hindustan Times says that Ukraine raised the issue with India's External Affairs Ministry on at least 2 occasions after these components were found on Shahed 136 drones. And it was also brought to the attention of the EU sanctions envoy, David O'Sullivan, when he visited New Delhi last month. Hindustan Times says Ukrainian authorities established that electronic components from Vishay Intertechnology and Aura Semiconductor, 2 companies, were in these Shahed 136s. So interesting, especially in light of Trump's comments about India and Russia's, in the form of Dmitry Peskov, his response about Trump's comments about India. So interesting to see that India's getting a little bit of diplomatic attention here. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. I'm also going to start with India. 3 days, of course, now. 3 days until the deadline passes set by President Trump, which would or could see severe tariffs on Russia and its allies, including India, which has been at least a financial ally for Moscow. And as things stand, there seems to be little sign of a climb down from that position. Indeed, Trump posted this on social media. India is not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil, they are, for much of the oil purchased, selling it on the open market for big profits. They don't care how many people in Ukraine are being killed by the Russian war machine. Because of this, I will be substantially raising the tariff paid by India to the USA. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President DJT. Now, many commentators have picked up on that phrase, Russian war machine, one frequently used by NATO and European leaders. It would seem that unless substantial changes happen before Friday, we can indeed expect there to be some serious tariffs announced, which, if upheld, a big if, given the fluctuations there have been on those set by Trump on Liberation Day, could ultimately have a considerable impact on Moscow's ability to wage the war. While the conflict is no longer a front-page story in the US, something attested by many of you who write into us, I do think it's noteworthy that the New York Post today, said to be Trump's favourite publication, or at least one that he browses, has published the account of a recently returned Ukrainian prisoner of war who was tortured by his Russian captors. To quote the piece, Andrei told the Post from his hospital bed in Ukraine that he would return with vengeance to the battle for his country's freedom against Moscow after suffering macabre and humiliating treatment. He sustained severe injuries to his legs and abdomen when Russians struck him with a grenade ahead of his capture on the front lines in February 2024. He spent the next 11 months undergoing horrific medical procedures in captivity in Russian hospitals before he was sent to a POW camp and eventually traded in a prisoner exchange in May. Most medical procedures were done without anaesthetics, he said. All were done while he was awake, save for a surgery early in his detainment that left his torso heavily bandaged. About 2 weeks after that procedure, Andrei discovered that under the bandages, his Russian surgeon had carved Slava Russia, a bastardization of the Ukrainian battle cry, Slava Ukraini. Now, we'll link to that piece in the show notes. And another prominent article in the US media at this significant moment is a long read in Time magazine called The Hidden War Over Ukraine's Lost Children by Simon Schuster, best known, of course, for his excellent biography of President Zelensky. We've interviewed Simon several times on the podcast over the years, and if you're looking for a long read that summarises the issue of kidnapped children in detail for somebody not familiar with the subject, I really recommend it, particularly for that purpose. And we'll, as I say, share that too. So that is the context in the US as Trump weighs up his options. And Trump's decisions relating to Russia are, as we all know, profoundly shaped by tensions with Beijing as well. And in that context, the Wall Street Journal has published an interesting read into how China is limiting the flow of critical minerals to Western defence manufacturers, delaying production and forcing companies to scour the world for stockpiles of the minerals needed to make everything, from bullets to jet fighters. As they say, earlier this year, as US-China trade tensions soared, Beijing tightened the controls it places on the export of rare earths. While Beijing allowed them to start flowing after the Trump administration agreed in June to a series of trade concessions, China has maintained a lock on critical minerals for defence purposes. China supplies around 90% of the world's rare earths and dominates the production of many other critical minerals. As a result, one drone parts manufacturer that supplies the US military was forced to delay orders by up to 2 months while it searched for a non-Chinese source of magnets. Certain materials needed by the defence industry now go for up to 5 more times than was typical before China's recent restrictions. One company said it was recently offered an element needed to make magnets that can withstand the extreme temperatures of a jet fighter engine for 60 times the standard price. The squeeze on critical minerals highlights how dependent the US military is on China for much of its supply chain, giving Beijing leverage at a time of rising tensions. Defence manufacturers supplying the US military rely on minerals that are mainly produced in China for microelectronics, drone motors, night vision goggles, missile targeting systems, and defence satellites. So a very interesting read there in the journal. And relating to that, of course, is the significant challenges that European weapons manufacturers have because of their dependence too on China. And if the US were to slowly withdraw from Europe, that would only be exaggerated given the significance of US support of European defence manufacturing. So you can imagine a situation, as we've talked about before, that China actually benefits from a US withdrawal because European firms would be obliged to then do deals, possibly even Ukraine, by the way, with Beijing. And how would that benefit the US? So one has to hope that these kind of conversations are taking place in Washington as we speak. Now, given the increased importance of the Pacific in geopolitical calculations, it's interesting that Mrs. Zelensky and Ukraine's foreign minister are in Japan this week, a key ally for Kyiv in that region. Minister Sibia posted earlier this: "The first day of my visit to Japan ended on a high note, with a warm and substantive meeting with my counterpart and steadfast friend of Ukraine, Foreign Minister Iwaya. We discussed the situation on the battlefield, current diplomatic efforts for a just peace, sanctions policy, cooperation with the UN, and common security challenges for our countries. Consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine are directly felt in the Asia-Pacific region as well. Minister Iwaya responded with deep empathy to the recent Russian attack on Kyiv and the tragic civilian losses. A key focus was accountability for the crime of aggression. I thank Japan for its role in the Special Tribunal Core Group, the Register of Damages, and the compensation mechanism. I also expressed heartfelt gratitude for Japan's generous financial, humanitarian, and reconstruction support. Ahead lies a major milestone, Japan hosting the Ukraine Mine Action Conference, a crucial step for rebuilding a safe Ukraine. We continue working together for our common goal, a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. So that was the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, but Mrs. Zelensky has also posted about her meeting with the president of Noima Corporation, one of Japan's largest electronics and digital retailers. Back at the beginning of the war, she wrote, he personally helped Ukrainians who evacuated to Japan with financial assistance. His corporation continues to support Ukrainian children in particular by donating laptops for school children in Odessa. Thank you for your trust. This partnership is the way to a decent future for our children. And if there are any other developments from that trip to Japan, of course, we will discuss it this week. Speaking of reconstruction support, I wanted to end this segment with an interesting story from Vienna, Austria, where Zelensky visited recently, which shows one possible route for long-term compensation to Kyiv because of the war. The Standard writes how 20 Russian properties in Vienna could be auctioned off, with proceeds going to Ukraine. The context being that following the annexation of Crimea way back in 2014, the Ukrainians demanded compensation from Russia, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled in their favour in 2023. This arbitration award could now be implemented in Vienna, among other places. The Inner City District Court has granted Ukrainian gas company Naftogaz an enforcement application. So according to a press release from them, the company has been awarded damages totaling $5 billion by the arbitration court. The real estate in Vienna would only cover a small portion of this, about 120 million euros. But the company's CEO said similar proceedings are underway in other countries. Sooner or later, Russia will pay for everything. So the length of time it's taken to get to this stage does tell you something. But nonetheless, it underscores there are international legal avenues which can and are being pursued. What isn't clear in this case is who owns the properties. Is it the Russian state? Is it sanctioned individuals? We don't know. But nonetheless, interesting. And it ends with another interesting snippet. Russia itself is continuously auctioning off Ukrainian assets belonging to individuals who have acted unfriendly toward Russia in the illegally annexed and occupied territories of Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk. As of the end of July 2025, the Russian state is said to have raised $28 million in this way. In Crimea alone, more than 100 buildings have already been sold, with another 300 to follow by the end of the year. An apartment belonging to the family of Zelensky in Yalta has already been auctioned. Its sale brought in around 400,000 euros, less than expected. Now, given everything that we know about Russia's activities in the occupied territories, this won't come as any surprise, but bear in mind, just to seize an individual's private property in territory seized by conquest has undeniable and uncomfortable echoes from the last century. And I would argue is yet another side of this conflict we should pay attention to, because it reshapes the moral assumptions of our world, if nothing else. So those are the key military and political updates. Now over to Adelie, who, while on her reporting trip in Ukraine, the fruits of which, of course, you'll hear in future episodes, shares with us another short dispatch.
Hi gang, hi London. I am currently in a car travelling from Kyiv to the north of the country. And I just wanted to put you with me in the car because I'm travelling through beautiful, beautiful fields of sunflowers against the bright blue sky of Ukraine in the summertime. It's the first time I'm in Ukraine in the summer, and it's really lovely to be discovering this country not with a big winter coat, and also be trying out all of their berries and all of their summer food, and to see Kyiv in very different light, where all the terraces and all the cafes are bustling with life, which is such a big discrepancy from the image that we have of a country at war. And yet, as with everywhere, in every war, normal life also continues, and that's what Ukrainians are fighting for. But anyways, I'm on this car with my fixer and our driver, and we're traveling to the north of the country. The fields are absolutely beautiful. We have exited Kyiv through the motorway that the Russians used when they invaded and got really close to the capital in 2022. When we were coming out of the city, I could see the rusty carcasses of tanks alongside the road, as well as regular dugouts and what would have been checkpoints in the early months of the war. Still some of them with camouflage nets on them, and they might still be used sometimes, so it didn't seem like there was anyone at this stage. As we exited the city and passed all of these carcasses and dugouts, we were crossing forests of tall red pines, which are absolutely beautiful and are very characteristic of the north of Kyiv, and passed through Irpin, Bucha and Hostomel. So along the motorway, you have people who go into the forest and pick up mushrooms, mostly chanterelles. They're very, very delicious. And you can see them, often older ladies, sat on buckets and selling chanterelles in plastic bottles by the side of the road on like makeshift little stands. You can also see people cycling alongside the road, some children, but mostly some adults, which is obviously a very nice thing to do in the summer. But my fixer tells me that it's become a lot harder to do now that the war is on, because you need to make sure where you're passing through, whether there will be air defense near you. You can't really keep track of missiles and raids. So it's obviously become a lot less carefree than it used to be. She also tells me that a classic summer activity and something she loved to do before the war was to go for a long walk in the forest. And nowadays, she doesn't do that as much on her free time. And she needs to triple check that there hasn't been a big battle where she's going for a walk, because one never knows whether they're going to come across an exploded ordnance. It's quite dangerous to go in the forest around Kyiv nowadays, and it's really changed the way people would approach their free time in the summer. We've also come across several very, very lovely rivers where in regular times you would want to go and take a dip in them. I'm not really sure people do that anymore. But anyways, we still have many hours of traveling ahead, so this is my first update, and I might do another one later on. And we're now walking around the centre of Koval, which is a town approximately 90,000 people, not very far from the Polish and the Belarusian border. It's very much at the west of Ukraine, so the war feels quite far away from here. Unlike in Kyiv, you don't see many signs of the war. There are very, very few people in military fatigues, very, very few soldiers around. There are actually very, very few men. On the streets at the bank where we were at this morning, there were literally only women selling flowers by the side of the road, selling vegetables, young girls selling necklaces and bracelets that they were making with pearls. But the streets are fairly empty of men, and I guess that's the biggest sign of the war. Apart from that, it is a lovely town that is still very much functioning. The only other signs of the war that we've noticed is by the local high school, the Lyceum. There were plaques for 3 local men, probably in their 40s, who had died in the last 3 years. We're walking around the centre at the moment, and so my fixer Alex and my driver Maxime were explaining to me how to them this was a city that felt incredibly Soviet. So the avenues are quite wide, and the buildings around us are called Hrushevska. Right? I said that right? Okay, very good. Which are typical buildings, 5-story apartment buildings built under the time of Khrushchev, the Soviet Union president, across the Soviet Union. So you can find them here in Koval in the west of Ukraine, you will find them in Kyiv, you will find them in Kramatorsk, you will find them in other former Soviet countries. They're all 5-story high, 5 doors, and they have a reputation for being really, really bad quality with very small apartments. The layout of the apartments is the same throughout all of these constructions and buildings, and that's basically what the center of the city is. And around that you have more private houses with little gardens that are quite cute actually, but these Hrushevska are very, very typical of a Soviet town. And it gave Alex and Maxim a bit of a chuckle. And they were explaining to me that they're actually quite different to another type of housing building built in the time of Stalin called Stalinka, right? Another nod. And the Stalinkas, on the contrary, are much, much, much better quality housing. The apartments are a lot bigger, the kitchens are a lot bigger, the ceilings are higher, and these are much better apartments than the Hrushevka. And that's actually what they're called here in Ukraine. The Stalinka, the buildings built under Stalin, and the Hrushevka, the buildings built under Khrushchev. So a really interesting bit of Soviet architecture for me this morning. We're gonna go and head back to the car and meet our sources, and I will be back with some more updates throughout the week. Thank you all for listening, and hello from Ukraine.
Thank you, as ever, to Adelie. Now to a longer than usual final thoughts for reasons which will become obvious in a moment. But Dom, over to you first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Francis. Well, I'm just looking at something here from Reuters saying that Putin is unlikely to bow to Donald Trump's sanctions ultimatum expiring on Friday. He thinks that the wind is in his sails. He thinks there's going to be a breakthrough on the battlefront in the next 2 to 3 months. So he's going to try and tough it out. So expect, this is Reuters citing sources close to the Kremlin, speaking to Reuters. And now they're suggesting he's going to try and tough it out with Trump and through the rest of this week. So that will be interesting. As we've been saying, it's interesting to see how kind of Trump sort of boxed himself into a corner on this one. There really is nowhere else for him to go. It's front and centre how Putin has been ignoring all these calls. So if that is true, that story from Reuters, and Putin is going to just try and tough this week out, it will be very interesting to see how Donald Trump handles that and whether or not he just sort of rolls over. Anyway, we will obviously see, but do go and have a look at that in Reuters. Do also go and have a look at RUSI, so the Royal United Services Institute, a global leader in military think tank. They've got a new paper out from Justin Bronk, who's a fantastic guy, really a deep thinker on airspace and military matters more widely. He's got a paper called NATO Should Not Replace Traditional Firepower with Drones. This is an interesting addition to this debate about how much drone warfare is changing the face of the battlefield. Is it a completely new paradigm or is it just an evolution, etc., etc.? Anyway, he says over-reliance on drones is leading to significant problems for Ukraine and is not something Western militaries should attempt to replicate. That's his basic sort of thesis. Now, he's made a number of assessments about it. He says Russia has developed a very good counter-drone technology because they've had to. Ukraine has largely ramped up its drone capabilities in the absence of having thousands of extra soldiers. So they've gone for the drones, and hence Russia has now got very good at countering drones. And Justin Bronk says Ukraine is still taking heavy casualties and slowly losing ground to Russian assaults despite being a world leader in developing, using and innovating with military UAS, as in unmanned or uninhabited air systems, drones to you and me. Now, his paper emphasises the need for a balanced force. He's making the point that drones add to the mix and work with artillery and anti-tank guided missiles and all the other stuff, each facilitating the other. There's no silver bullet here. I hate seeing articles talking about game-changing technology because A, it's not a game, and B, there's not one new weapon system bar atomic weapons really that fundamentally shifted the way that warfare was conducted. Anyway, he also makes the point, as we have as well, that the war in Ukraine right now, it's one type of warfare. It's largely static, it's defensive, as far as Ukraine is concerned. It's attritional, it's grinding. It's not a high-tempo manoeuvre battle, and therefore relying too hard on the lessons that we're seeing about drones in this capacity could lead you to make mistakes about what it means for warfare more broadly. Justin says when the front lines are largely static, the slower response time and lower reliability of first-person view drones against hardened targets compared to bonus rounds, come on to those in a moment, and anti-tank guided missiles doesn't matter nearly so much, and their far greater availability, this is the drones, allows them to be expended more sustainably. Now, the bonus round that he's talking about there, it's a 155mm smart artillery round. It's got, each one has 2 autonomous sensor-fused submunitions. They kind of burst out of the shell and they can detect and identify armoured vehicles and then zoom down to blast them. Stop me if I'm getting too technical. So anyway, do go and have a look at this paper. It's on Rus's website. Really interesting addition to the debate, a counter to those that might say that drones are the way ahead. There's no need for tanks anymore or artillery, blah, blah, blah. We will, of course, put the link in the episode notes, but I think that's a very valuable contribution and a good explainer for the pros and cons of drones, and I think where they do fit into the evolving way of warfare. Thanks.
Thanks, Dom. A slightly longer final thought from me today, but I wanted to take an opportunity to give voice to the many volunteers who've written in recently. We try, of course, to talk about the invaluable humanitarian work that's done in Ukraine as much as possible, but it's never enough given its importance, and I hope that we can, just by giving voice to a few of you, put pay to that a little today. And so I'll start by quoting one from John. Hi, John. He writes, "I'm coming to the end of my third relatively short stint of volunteer work in Ukraine since the war began. Nothing glamorous or high profile, just food preparation, baking and camouflage net making. I first heard about the possibilities for volunteering here from an interview you hosted on your show, and it resulted in me spending a week or so in June 2023 doing food prep in Lviv for the military. Following that, I spent a couple of weeks, mainly in Kharkiv, in June 2024 and again this year. Like many international volunteer workers doing what I do, I wonder whether it would be better if I just stayed at home and gave the money I save to some of the many important charities working in and on Ukraine. There's certainly a good argument in favour of this, but perhaps selfishly, I still think it is worthwhile making the trip from London for 10 days, if only because it shows Ukrainians that they are not forgotten and that I really appreciate they are fighting for us all, certainly in Europe, and we are heavily indebted to them. It also gives me licence to continue raising the issue with anyone at home who will or will not listen. The group I volunteered with a couple of times, Kharkiv's Hell's Kitchen, sent a questionnaire out a good few months ago to international alumni asking, among other things, why they come. It was a good question. In addition to my previous comments, if it goes badly wrong in Ukraine, then I fear for our future, not just Ukraine's. Anyway, at least this email has helped me pass a bit of time on my 7-hour train journey from Kyiv to a sadly rainy Lviv. All the best and thanks again." Well, thank you very much, John. Then we've got another from Phyllis in the United States. She writes, "Hello, Ukraine the latest. I summoned volunteers in Ukraine this March and April, falling in love with people and places. I prevailed upon my hosts in Kyiv to bring me to the office of PEN Ukraine, in part to see their tribute to David, but also because I admire the philosophical cultural activism of explaining Ukraine and thinking in dark times, and particularly their delivering books to the front line. I offer talks, small conversations to local libraries and bookstores, to whoever is interested, in which I try to encourage Americans to learn more about Ukraine and the war, the history we don't know, but also innovative technology, cultural vibrancy, and Ukraine's significance to the current crisis in American governance, not to mention Europe's. Ukraine in the US has slipped to page 8, its fate seemingly dependent on Donald Trump's irritable moods. That is nearly unbearable. Mine is a local effort, a small scale, but I hope it is still valuable for continuing the conversation on a human level." And then just lastly, Johan from Sweden writes, "Hello, Dom and Francis. There are many of us who try to do what we can to compensate for the lack of will, lack of moral compass, and lack of common sense among the politicians who should be defending democracy against tyranny in a time when the world order is being put to the test as it has not been since the 1940s. We, volunteers, are doing what we can. I fundraise and buy ambulances, which I drive to Ukraine. It's not a big, grand operation. It is marginal. But I do it for the sake of my own mental health and to do what I can. I also write songs about the stories I hear. The songs give me a chance to be heard, and when I speak or sing about Ukraine, people donate £1 or £2 to the fundraiser. I'm gathering money for my second ambulance now. Hopefully, I can make another trip soon. I'd like to go tomorrow, but more realistically, it will happen late this autumn. I hear from my contacts in Ukraine that fewer volunteers than before are active. Resources are distributed unevenly sometimes. For some medical clinics and some frontline units, volunteers have been a great help. It worries me that fewer people from our Western countries are showing up. Perhaps you could help by explaining how much this movement means. Kind regards, Johan. Well, Johan, I think you've already answered your own question, because yes, volunteers are not just important in this war, they're essential. Through their actions, not just their voices, they've shown the world what commitment, courage, humanity look like in the face of the brutality that we've been reporting on these last 3.5 years. And I think in war it's dangerously easy to slip into abstraction, to reduce suffering to numbers, to speak in headlines and statistics. But volunteers don't have that luxury. They're on the front lines of medical support, of compassion, and standing face to face with the consequences of violence, delivering aid, evacuating families, comforting the elderly, rebuilding communities that have been torn apart. Without them, literally, countless lives would have been lost. And that was abundantly clear when we visited those elderly civilians near Kharkiv back in December, still holding on, not just because of food or shelter, but because someone showed up, someone cared, and that came across very, very strongly. And there's another kind of strength volunteers bring more widely, and that's morale, nationally and internationally. Their presence, your presence, a refusal to look away reminds Ukrainians they're not alone. And that matters more than history will ever accurately record. And it's a real honour for us, a profound one, to speak about the work volunteers are doing, whether you're risking your life at the front, organising support from abroad, or simply giving time and heart where it's needed most. We see you, Ukrainians see you, and we thank you and salute you. So, as I say, there's no amount of words that we can express to underscore the importance of volunteers. But I hope that just by giving voice to those of you who do write in every now and then, we do some work to try and emphasise how important it is. But Dom, do you have anything to add on that?
Thanks, Francis. I'll just echo your comments that we really appreciate the view from the volunteers that we speak to and that we go and visit with, because it is absolutely invaluable to get that side of life. We will continue to do so. But I've just noticed in the last minute, breaking from President Zelensky, he's put out on Twitter. So as we said, he's been visiting various brigades at the front, and he said he's convened a meeting of his staff with some readouts from those, talking about training centres, drones, blah, 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 blah. But the thing that caught my eye, one of the things in particular that they were talking about was the contracts 18 to 24. As we know, as we've been saying, this issue of mobilisation and at what age you mobilise your population is hugely controversial in Ukraine. The current age is 25, so men younger than that are not being mobilised. It is controversial. They have this programme called Contracts 18 to 24. President Zelensky has just tweeted a minute ago, he said the programme must be expanded. We, that's he and his staff, we discussed several options today, including increasing the age. I don't quite know what he means by that, because above 24, you can be conscripted. Anyway, he said we discussed several options today, including increasing the age and broadening the circumstances under which this type of contract can be signed. The Ministry of Defence, the General Staff and the office team must present the details to the public. And then at the end of his tweet, rounding up everything, like I say, with all the other bits and bobs about drones and money and fortifications and what have you, he said the deadline for presenting implementation plans for these decisions made during the meetings and the staff session is Monday. On Monday, I expect reports from the Secretary of the National Security and Defence Council, the Ministry of Defence, the Commander-in-Chief, the General Staff and the Office team on the progress of implementation. So that's literally just come out President Zelensky tweeted that just a couple of minutes ago, and I think that bit there about the contracts addressing the manpower issue is the most interesting for me. Whether or not how that will play out, what it means, what these contracts mean, who is eligible for them, and whether or not there's any encouragement / coercion. I do not know. If you are unemployed and not in education or employment, perhaps you may now be eligible. I do not know. I don't know the detail. I'm speculating, but we will find out on Monday. But I just wanted to bring that to our listeners, Francis.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.